This video has been produced to support community engagement about the rate options study for Snowy Valleys Council. It's part of a series as shown on your screen, and I would encourage you to start with the introduction video as this provides the background and context for what I'll go through specifically in relation to farmland for this video. As a starting point, I'll look at the current rating structure that's in place for farmland in each of the former councils. In Tumut, like each of the categories, there's a $540 minimum rate that applies, and the rates above that threshold of about $100,000 are determined on the ad valorem, which is the rate in the dollar which goes up with the value of your property. In the former Tumbarumba Shire, there's again a base rate in place, but unlike residential where 50% of the overall rate revenues come from the base rate, here only 5% of the revenues come from the base and 95% from the ad valorem rate. So in other words, most of the rate revenues are determined based on the value of properties, which makes sense with farmland where there's a big gap between high and low value land. So comparing the current rating structures side by side, you can see that rates in Tumut are higher across all of the property values. The chart that I've added at the bottom shows the distribution of property values in Tumut, and you can see that the majority, about 75% of them, are valued under $400,000, but it's worth noting that there are about 10% of properties that are actually off the end of this scale, over $750,000. And if we then overlay the property values in the former Tumbarumba Shire, you can see that there's a fairly even distribution, which was different from residential where the average property values in Tumbarumba were lower than those in Tumut. It's important to note that this is looking at the value of particular farming properties, but it's also worth noting that on a dollars per hectare basis, there's not a considerable difference between the two former councils. So looking at option A for farmland, shown by the green line there, you can see that it starts off from the same point as the red line, the current rating system in Tumba, because Tumba's rates currently are a 5% base rate and about $95. And when you're looking at the higher end of property values, the green line is landing somewhere in the middle of the two rating structures at the moment when they come together. So the blue line that I've added below shows the impacts of this option on ratepayers in the former Tumut Shire. Down the lower end of property values, with the elimination of the minimum rate, there's some considerable savings for ratepayers in Tumut. There's a group around $100,000 that would see a slight increase of about 5% under this option. And at the higher end of property values, there'd be a saving approaching around 10%. When we now look at the red line, which shows the impacts on farmland ratepayers in the former Tumba Shire, you can see it's fairly flat, which means the impacts are fairly consistent in percentage terms across all land values. It's about a 9% increase for all those properties. Moving on to option B, which is shown as the purple line, the higher base rate is pushing up the bottom end slightly. This also has the effect of reducing rates at the higher end of the property values slightly. And when we look at the impacts of this option on ratepayers in the former Tumut Shire, we can see that the savings for those currently on the minimum are slightly reduced. There's a larger group in the middle around the $100,000 mark who are paying a bit more, and that is getting up to around 20% for some people. While at the higher end of the property values, there is some larger savings. Moving on to the impact of this option on ratepayers in the former Tumba Shire, you can see that the higher base rate is pushing up the increases for the lower property values in Tumbarumba very significantly in percentage terms, around 50% for some properties. But in dollar terms, the increase is about $100 a year. And even with this increase, the amount that they will be paying is about $63 less than the ratepayers in Tumut that are currently on the minimum, which is $540. What this option also does is just pushes down the rates slightly at the higher end of the scale. So as with residential, this is the key question when we're trying to determine what is the fairest rating structure, because having a slightly higher base rate does mean that everyone pays a bit more of a contribution towards the cost of the services that they enjoy. It's worth noting that a 10% base rate is not high compared to other councils. There are a few that are around the 7% mark, but there's plenty that are higher as well. Moving on to option C for farmland, a 15% base rate. Again, this is not out of step with other councils. There's still a number that are higher and a number that are lower. It's sort of still middle range. We can see that it's just magnifying slightly the impacts that we saw under option B. It's important to note that the increases at the lower end are getting significant in percentage terms, particularly in Tumbarumba, but also for a group in Tumut around the $100,000 mark. But in dollar terms, it's around the current $540 minimum that's in place in Tumut now. This option also pushes down the rates slightly more at the higher end of the scale, which means everyone's making a bit more of a contribution towards the cost of the services they enjoy. So comparing the three options side by side, option A is a 5% base rate, and that's what's in place in Tumbarumba now, which is why there's a fairly consistent increase of about 9% across the board for all Tumbarumba farmland ratepayers. And under this option, those currently on the minimum rate in Tumut pay significantly less, and those at the higher end see savings of 5 to 10%. Option B increases the base rate to 10%, or about $190 a year, and that has the effect of flattening out the rates a bit, increasing them at the lower end of values and decreasing them at the higher end. And while that does result in some considerable increases in percentage terms for lower value properties in Tumbarumba, the increase in dollar terms is less. They'd be paying an extra $100 a year, but that's still $60 odd a year less than the $540 minimum paid by ratepayers with the same value properties in Tumut at the moment. And finally, option C increases the base rate up to 15%, or about $285 a year. And this results in larger increases in rates for farms at the lower end of property values in Tumbarumba, bringing them up to somewhere around the $540 minimum that's paid on similar valued properties in Tumut at the moment. And it also results in increases of around 30% for farms in Tumut, around the $100,000 mark. So thanks for taking the time to watch this video and hear a bit more about the rate options for farmland in Snowy Valleys Council, and I'd encourage you again to complete the survey and check out the other information available at the link shown on your screen.